The Chronicle, the West Island's local newspaper. So this newspaper served the West Island community for just over 90 years. The importance of a local newspaper can't be expressed enough. When you have a newspaper like the Gazette, you'll get an article every now and then about the West Island. Sure, it did have the West Island News eventually, but the importance of a local newspaper like this, it's uncomparable. It really gets down into the nitty-gritty of what's going on, let's say, in the high school level, the local sports level, the local athletes, the local communities, the local not-for-profits, and so on and so on and so on. Now, this is from 1990, the Chronicle. You might remember it as the News and Chronicle, or maybe you remember it as the Lakeshore News and the West Island Chronicle, or maybe just the Lakeshore News. Or maybe you're older and you remember it as the Lakeshore Press. This newspaper started in 1924, and it's gone through a couple different names, and it's gone through a few different owners. But there was a very special couple that bought the newspaper in 1946, saving it from extinction and essentially bringing that newspaper that existed in 45 into what you remember it as. The Lakeshore News, News and Chronicle, the Chronicle. That couple was John Freeman and Helen Freeman, maiden name Helen Legg, but we'll get into her a little later on. Now, this here is a story about John Freeman. I was incredibly honored to be able to sit down and speak with John Freeman's two sons, who are still here in the West Island. One of them still here in Point Claire. So I wanted to just give a brief preface to this interview that as much as I saw John Freeman's name in the Lakeshore News, and it was important for me to thank his sons, for all the work that his father did and everyone who worked for him, because they are essentially the reason why I'm able to do what I'm doing. This isn't necessarily a video about the Lakeshore News. This is more a video to get to know the guy who saved the Lakeshore Press, which became the Lakeshore News, and subsequently became the Chronicle. So here's part one of my interview with Jim and Peter Freeman, the sons of John Freeman, the editor and owner of the Lakeshore News. I want to start off by saying that in the Endangered Stories series, I've been using the Lakeshore News as my main source of education on what happened in the yesteryear of Point Claire, going all the way back to the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s. It was almost by accident that I discovered that these newspapers existed. I remember the News and Chronicle and the Chronicle, but I had no idea that it went back that far. I had no idea, because of my age, that Point Claire went back that far. So I've been using them ad nauseum. I mean, I read it like a book. We were saying that there's recurring characters. You start to learn names of people. You learn if they have families and wives. And one name, of course, that always came up after 1946 is John Freeman, of course, who was the publisher of the Lakeshore News from 1946. I'd never thought to seek out a Freeman to figure out what's the background story of him or the newspaper. I didn't know how to approach it, if I can be honest with you. I'm still nervous about it because it's kind of like being with the son of a celebrity, because I've seen his name so much in the course of the last 3 years. So to know that he had offsprings was fantastic. And hopefully you can help me connect some dots. Jim and Peter Freeman, the two sons of John Freeman and Helen Freeman. I'm excited to be here. big time.
Thank you, Jason. So are we.
This is 2024. This is 100 years since that newspaper started. I only coincidentally figured that out yesterday, even after reading the 50th anniversary in 74 and the 75th anniversary. It's 100 years since they did the Lakeshore Record, which was typed up.
Lakeshore Press, Lakeshore
The
Record.
Lakeshore Record.
Lakeshore
right.
Record.
And then in 1925, when they started printing it, they changed it to press. And it continued that way until he sold it to your father in 46. So I want to start with John. So tell me about John and where his life started.
John was born in Melbourne, Australia, on December 4, 1917. And as a young man, he got apprenticed to a print shop. And he was offered it after grade 8. He only had a grade 8 education, and he was offered this apprenticeship. And at the end of the day, he beat black. So they called him a devil's apprentice because he was responsible for inking the rollers on the printing and the printing presses they used at the time. Then the war ended up breaking out, or the prospect of war, and Australia was quite nervous because of the pending threat by the Japanese on the north, especially in the north in Darwin and not that far south of Papua New Guinea, and the interest that Japan had in its imperialistic endeavors. Make a long story short, my father joined the army. He was in the Messenger Corps, actually drove a Norton Commander bike. He was in the artillery, but he finally got up enough gumption or brass tacks to tell his father he didn't like the army. He wanted to join the Air Force. So into the Air Force he went, and he ended up getting transferred to Canada. There were very few Australians who got transferred to the European theater of war, but he ended up being transferred to Eastern Canada and ended up getting his wings in St. Hubert Air Base.
They would train in St. Hubert Air Base, and they would fly around the mountain there. And he met my mother, who's my mother's father, Walter Legg, owned a newspaper in Granby called the Leader Mail. And her brother, Donald, who was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, was given the little job one Christmas Eve of wandering around the base, St. Hubert Air Base, and seeing if there were any airmen there that had nowhere to go on Christmas. And he saw supposedly this forlorn airman walking around. It was my dad, and he invited him to Christmas Eve dinner, I think, in Granby, and he took him to Granby, and that's how he met my mother, and the rest is history, as I say.
But when he came back, it was known, or became known, that they were going to get married. So upon that, and the promise of a job, be it with the Leader Mail and or getting their eyes on a paper to buy, my grandfather, Walter, wrote to the Australian High Commission saying that he has a prospect, he's getting married to my daughter, he has a prospect of a job, we can guarantee his livelihood. Is it all right if he stays in Canada, or must he go back to the country of his birth from which he enlisted, as is required by law? They let him stay in Canada. When he got decommissioned from St. Hubert, my mother picked him up, and he had 40 cents in his pocket, and that they went on from there.
It was probably 45, I'm guessing, when he came back.
I'm not sure.
I don't.
Because
James
Smeel, he had an ad to sell the Lakeshore Press in late 45, and for sale, Lakeshore Press.
Wow.
And
So this is August 45. So by August 45, they were still looking for a buyer.
Yep.
And it was said
Must be.
in the newspaper that they were engaged when they bought the company, when they bought the press.
Yeah.
okay.
So we're talking about, he was probably back for a few months, you know,
Yeah, the
unless Walter maybe purchased it ahead of time or something. So that's what you were saying about he was a part of an association, right? What was it? The Weekly
Canadian Weekly Newspapers Association.
I think that Walter and Smeel they knew each other.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised.
I think they knew each other. and I think that they probably worked together the details.
Especially,
They would have definitely known each other.
so they would have known each other, absolutely.
Yeah,
This is
Probably helped
fascinating.
facilitate the sale
yeah.
Yeah,
of the paper.
So
he would have had to have known.
here's the announcement.
Wow.
I
That's
think I've seen
amazing.
that, yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, January
Yeah,
19th.
the Lakeshore News, which I'm sure
So this is the Gazette.
Good for
your
you.
viewers will see some
That's amazing.
examples of the first paper.
Yeah.
It wasn't fully broadsheet. I guess it was a smaller format.
This is
Yeah.
January 5th. They must have been talking about the engagement. I'm sure that Walter had a hand in the arrangements of purchasing the paper with
He would have
Smeal.
to have.
And then it was, if you're going to come back to Canada, you're not coming back with the prospect of marrying my daughter. Was already.
He had to have some
Yeah.
kind of proof to back
Yeah.
up what he was saying in
Yeah.
order for him to be granted stay.
Decommissioned, purchasing the paper, engagement,
Yeah.
and but we're talking about moving to Point Claire. You know what I'm curious about is your father being from Australia. His head is filled with war for the past how many years? Now he's in a foreign country, in a tiny little village, newly married, and it's not that he has to work a job where he has a skill, but he has to report on the happenings of the lakeshore. How do you do something like that? How do you get that deep into what's happening in the lakeshore to be able to write articles about from Dixie, not Dixie, but what do they call it, Strathmore, as the area used to be called, all the way down to St. Annabelle?
He ran around and did a lot of things. He was a photographer. I mean, they didn't. I'm not sure what kind of staff they would have had at the beginning, but I think he
Well, he had
was.
Smeal. Smeal stuck around
Okay.
as a contributor. Smeal's column, I think they called it.
But he was a very, very tolerant person. He would let you go and run with it if you had an idea. He hired some good people and he let them do their job. He would guide them. I'm just thinking of some of the early people that came later and mentioning them totally out of order, but he would hire people and let them do their job. There was the social editor, Christine Dixon. There was Bill Stockwell. There was Dave Anderson with circulation, but these were in the 60s and 70s, if I'm not mistaken. But he would let people do their job. He was more of an advisor and a mentor is the word I'm looking for. I don't know whom he hired first, but he had some good people.
Now, your father also assumed another type of responsibility, which was because he had his ear to the ground and he was connected to everyone, he would know when maybe funds needed to be raised for a particular cause.
Quite right.
And one of those was for the fire department.
Yeah.
If they needed new vehicles or anything new, so he was very much involved in the first ambulance along the lakeshore. So your father's responsible for the very first ambulance that existed here along the lakeshore.
That's amazing. I'd forgotten that, but it's so true. I really had forgotten that.
So I mean,
That's amazing.
he's not just a publisher in that sense, He had a lot more value than that in the community.
Oh, very much so. He instigated other things too. I mean, with time, he was on the Lakeshore Hospital Foundation, and was its past president of the foundation in raising funds. Through his voice as editor or publisher of the New Chronicle, he would write editorials and fight tooth and nail against the MUC because he saw it as a direct tax threat without any improvement in the managing of police or ambulance services, or what was purported to be a benefit was still years away from happening. He was a principal proponent of fluoridation of the water in Point Claire. And if I'm not counting at all, it's because of my memory, but he was an integral part of the community and helping it to grow.
I don't know the terms exactly. In '58, it went from, was it tabloid size to a full size.
Full size.
In '58 was the year that it made that jump.
That transition.
Yeah, and
Part of it was having a printing press out was able.
That could handle
was
it.
he printing in St. Anne de Bellevue, I think?
Lachine, it was.
Lachine?
Was it? Yeah. Yes, it was at the time.
The thing is that the proofreading was a very big part of it because all the typesetters were French, and they made a lot of mistakes. So it had to be proofread before it went to bed. And it was always a Wednesday night. Paper was delivered. It changed by one day, but it wasn't a Thursday delivery, I think. And we would go to bed, like Wednesday night was the printing, and it was always a busy night. It was a very late night for him.
Yeah.
Do you remember a little bit about that? Can you set the scene a little bit? What that was like?
He wouldn't. He would go off. He wouldn't be at home Wednesday.
Yeah.
He'd be at the office, and he would. I don't know if he came home and had a quick bite to eat, or he grabbed something on the way. But then he would go into. He'd go into the print shop. He'd go down to the printers, and see to it that everything was okay. I mean, it got a bit more automated. As we grew up, we could see that. But at the beginning of the years, no, we were alone with Mom a lot.
It eventually became offset printing, which saved a lot of money and time.
The paper, as you said, was still growing.
Yeah.
And not long after that, along it came, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a bit, but in 1967, it won the Governor General's Award for the best all-around weekly newspaper in Canada during Centennial Year. That's an award that comes around once every 100 years. Boom, done. And
Well, the Canadian Weekly Newspapers Association Award. And,
And
he got the award from Prime Minister Pearson in Ottawa, and we have a photograph and a story about that. But it had won many smaller awards because there was awards for sports, there was awards for layout, advertising, editorial.
What else would there have been? The other ones would have been the ones that were coming out of the city, no? Were there other, like Lachine didn't have one, I don't think?
No.
No, did it
Not
win?
the-
Did it win? It wasn't linguistically
No.
categorized.
No, it was across the country though. It was for this particular award was for a member papers of circulation 6,000 and over.
more.
But by that point, the circulation was already well over 20,000.
24,000.
In 1967, it was
Yeah,
probably over 20,000.
I remember when they went, because I worked there at that time, that summer, and Dad won the award. And I can still see him walk around the office. The award we want, nobody's paying attention to him because they're trying to put the paper to bed. Yeah, advertising's running around with their heads cut off, trying to get the right ads going, and
Circulation.
editorial is pounding away. Yeah, trying to get their columns and news stories out. And Dad's we won, and no one's paying them much attention. Of course, they did after the fact, but he couldn't believe it. He was so proud. And he was he was silent that way. He wasn't a show-off person. But my God, I think he was so proud, and he knew he had a good team.
Another interesting thing I remember about my father's personality, the odd time he had to fire somebody, and I remember once he had to fire an editor, but he had to fire the odd person, and you could always tell when he did it because the night before he threw up half the night. It affected him so much that the next morning he'd have to go in and fire somebody.
So your father retires in '76, I believe.
Yeah.
And then
But he stayed on he stayed on writing. It was exactly a year after he retired, Jim, that he passed away.
Yep.
Because he died on January the 2nd, '78,
Yep.
and he was only 60.
it was a community newspaper, and that's what I mean by it's not like when you work for the Gazette and you can go to a store, you don't have to see the person anymore.
Yeah.
The world was still his world that he was reporting on was quite small, and that's what I mean by when you read the paper, there's only about a dozen or two reoccurring characters at that time that was of your father's generation,
Yep.
and maybe let's say 10 years his senior. You know, before there's not that many, and then we have the boomers, but it's really your father's generation who built this entire city.
Quite so.
They pretty much established exactly what it was. Because before '46, you had Cedar Avenue, you had a bit in Valois, you had the Village. What else did you have at that time?
Good point.
Yeah.
Right? Everything was a mom and pop shop, essentially. It was before A&P, before Dominion.
Yeah.
You'd have a Legault grocer in the village, and you'd have
That's right. You had a Legault also in Valois. So now in hindsight, especially with because you've seen some of the endangered stories that you enjoy the some of the endangered stories videos that you've seen. It's kind of full circle because I'm able to enjoy the content that you enjoy. You're able to enjoy the content that I've created
Totally.
because of what your father continued. Having not made that connection maybe up until we had spoken.
everything's brought full circle. It was quite remarkable.
Yeah.
In hindsight, how does it make you feel to know that at least there's one person here who finds incredible value in and when I mean, I don't just mean the articles, like I said, I mean every inch of that newspaper. It helps to tell the history of Point Claire and the
Of
Lakeshore.
growth. And what is time but a series of memories? These are snapshots of the meaning. I am so terribly proud that we had parents like that because they became a defining, just by their actions, by their stillness of being, or, just not interrupting other people's lives, but kind of recording it through events. Just so terribly proud of their growth to a community that didn't set out to become a growth to the community, set out to build a paper, which did become a defining factor for growth of a community. Yeah. People succeeded and people saw themselves, and I think that that is the worth of the dynamic of the paper was their input.
But and with this interview and with this piece you're going to produce, it's almost as if time has stopped.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy that your life goes on. One day goes to the next, 1 week goes to the next, 1 month goes to the next, and then I'm surprised I'm in my 70s now. But when you look back and you see that history and appreciate what
Very much so.
What the paper meant to a lot of people in the West Island and the Lakeshore, and how it contributed to the growth of the West Island and
how you can keep this alive, how you're keeping it alive.
Exactly.
By bringing these stories out.
There's so many incredible things, and it's all right there in the newspaper. And I hope that the city will be able to archive it properly and digitize it.
The newspaper grew with the West Island, but the West Island grew with the newspaper.
Yep, it's true.
It was both ways.
Yep, symbiotic relationship for sure.
Great, you made it to the end. I couldn't be more grateful that you're still here and that you made it the whole way through. And I really hope that you were able to learn something new, or maybe reminded of stuff that you remembered from way back when, and something maybe that you can share with other people. Fun little stories. As always, if you like this channel and you enjoy the content, you want to support me to continue to do exactly what I have been doing, there's a PayPal link in the description below, or you can send a donation any which way you'd like that you feel comfortable with. Just send me a message and shoot me an email, and we can work something out. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next one.